Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, dear faculty, students and friends, dear colleagues who are all online. My name is Cornelia Woll, I'm the president of the Hertie School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to the Henrik Enderlein Forum or to your screen for the annual flagship event of the Decarb Future Economy Forum. Today we will be looking at green innovation and strategies to implement them. As all of you in this room are well aware, carbon emissions are on the rise even after successful negotiations like the Paris Agreement. Addressing this challenge is one of the most complex issues of our times, requiring intense cooperation between all sectors of our society, from governments to multinational corporations and everyday citizens. However, there are some bright spots in this discussion, which doesn't have a lot of bright spots. The costs of clean technologies like solar, wind, lithium-ion batteries have been steadily declining. However, this progress is not yet present in all of the most promising clean technologies. We need to see similar cost declines in more of the technologies like cement and eventually carbon removal. Getting there with the speed necessary to address the challenge will require policy innovation. So it's not just the alternatives to carbon-intensive technologies that matter, but also innovation in how to deal with the carbon we cannot do without, or how to reduce carbon where we do not know how to do it entirely differently. All of this brings us to our event today. We will need creative minds discussing the best policies to get us there, and it's conferences like these that can help us chart the path forward. I strongly believe that it is a crucial job of universities to both contribute expertise and serve as a forum for open discussions. This is something that we here at the Hertie School in our Center for Sustainability are working on every day, from advising the German government on energy policy to training the next generation of policymakers and trying to host and contribute to conferences like these. And for this reason, it's also a great pleasure to be able to help you as a university encompassing organization to bring together experts, students, and decision makers. We will hear from a series of experts on some of the most important and promising areas in climate innovation. The first panel will examine carbon contracts for climate difference, bringing in perspectives from academics and policymakers alike. On this panel, we will hear from Karsten Neuhoff of DIW, Friedrich von Schönfeld from Germany's Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, as well as Johanna Schiele from the European Commission. We will learn more about decarbonization of cement, which is a pillar of the German economy and responsible for 4% of the EU's current CO2 emission. This panel will feature Caroline Bossmeier of Heidelberg Materials, Dr. Volker Thome of Fraunhofer's Institute for Manufacturing, Engineering and Automation, and moderator Dr. Tobias Lechtenfeld. Afterwards, there will be a first panel where Marianne Krüger from Remove, the final panel with Marianne Krüger, Lisa Mantasreda from the Verein für Negativemissionen, Devina Banerjee from Carbon Gap, and moderator Niels Hendler will discuss carbon removal technologies, an area that has become increasingly prominent in policy discussions. We also have innovation in the program and not just in carbon removal. And one innovation is that there is a keynote speaker, a virtual keynote from Sony Kapoor that was added last night, which I hope you've already seen. I would like to thank all of our experts on these panels and the moderators who've taken the time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. And the one person I haven't mentioned is Nicola Brandt, who's also moderating and who I'm particularly pleased to see here, because when we first partnered with Decarb last year, it was based on a conference that came out of discussions between you and me and Brian Cahin, and I'm so pleased that we can continue having this exchange and that you are back here for this year's annual conference, and I'm very much looking forward to see what you will produce in your exchanges and in the discussions with the audience afterwards. But let me just close with a word of thanks. This is not a Hertie conference, it's a Decarb conference with a lot of partners, so thank you very much to Niels Hendler, to Johanna Cooper, where is she? I just saw her. To Johanna Cooper, who spearheaded the coordination of this conference, and additionally a big thank to our Center for Sustainability staff who supported this conference, as well as all the organizational units around it. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to one of our organizers, Niels Handler, for the further explanation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks especially you, Cornelia, on behalf of the whole Decarb team. And it's really, we want to express our sincere gratitude that we can be here. We wouldn't be here without the support of the Hertie School, the Sustainability Center, so Leon Hirt, Christian Flaxland, Jenny Schwa, and Bernardo Bock. Thanks for your help and support, and we really couldn't have done it without you. So thanks very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to today's event on breaking through the green innovation. How do we get there? I'm delighted to see so many of you here gathered and passionately advocating for sustainability. Your presence underscores the collective commitment that we share towards addressing one of the most challenges of our time, and that is climate change. And so we're at the beginning of a new era on green innovation, and so today's discussions are more critical than ever. The urgency of our mission is clear, to decarbonize our economies without compromising our industrial capabilities, to foster technological advancement and that can lead us to a more sustainable future, and to navigate the complex landscape of societal and regulatory change on the way over there. So over the past few decades, we've made significant strides in understanding the science of climate change and the dire consequences of inaction. Reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and initiatives such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative have highlighted the necessity to both reducing emissions and implementing effective carbon removal strategies. And yet the path to achieving these goals is fraught with challenges. I have just one. Oh, I do? Okay. Yeah. So as Cornelia already mentioned, essentially like the bad news here is on the left-hand side, that the emissions are rising. You can add several international conferences here, the Kyoto Paris Agreement or the Copenhagen Agreement, and yet sort of unfortunately still emissions continue to rise. The good news, on the other hand, is that we see cost regressions in a number of clean technologies. So most importantly, solar PV, wind energy, lithium-ion batteries. And essentially what we're here sort of discussing today is like, how can we foster more of these cost regressions? Because that's essentially like one of the best news we have on combating climate change. So we want to address these challenges head on, focus on the two challenges of the current net zero policies. So first, how to de-risk necessary investment in clean technologies leveraging contracts for difference, a novel policy tool. Second, on how to decarbonize cement, as just, for example, the concrete embodied in the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative can topple the entire Paris Agreement. And third, how you can remove carbon from the atmosphere, that is, pull the plug on the bathtub filling up with emissions. So last year's videographer, Jonas, who's again here today, last year asked Johanna sort of why, she was sort of part of Decarb. She essentially just said, join Decarb, it's fun. So this year she's essentially running the show. So I'd say it's a bit of a steep learning curve. And so my message essentially for all Hertie students is, join us, it's fun. And it's the one thing I think we're really good at is to signal potential future employers that you really care about decarbonizing our economy. So as such, many thanks to the whole Decarb team. This was a lot of work and from a lot of people involved, some of them here, some couldn't make it, but so special thanks to Malte Herten, Elina Dilger, Christiana Heise, Simon Raber, Friedemann Grunner, Henriette Weser, Alice Dennis, Alexander Roth, and Tobias Bergmann. And so I encourage you all to fully interact in today's sessions, to challenge assumptions, and to think boldly about the solutions that we need. And so we can all secure a sustainable future. And thank you all, and let's get started.
Yeah, and I'm Nicola Brandt, and I'm, so Cornelia's just walking out because she has other things to do, but I'm equally pleased that we can continue this collaboration, Niels, with Decarb, and that we can talk about innovation today. So we're seeing the technology cost over years. It can come down, but of course we have a lot of well, things to produce, such as basic materials, where costs are still much higher if you use fossil-free or fossil carbon-neutral production procedures. And so we need instruments to spur the innovation. And this is what the first panel will be about. We'll talk about auctions, the ones that we have in Germany, CCfDs, auctions that we have in the EU Commission. And we are very lucky because we really have a set of experts that can explain to us how it works with other, interacts with other instruments. And I'm very pleased to ask my panel on stage. We will first hear from Karsten Neuhoff. Although, well, I'm just thinking, I wanted to ask you on stage, but perhaps the best thing is that you give your presentation first, Karsten, and then the panel drips in and I present you later. So Karsten is a professor at TU Berlin, and we already heard, head of climate policy department at EIW, and he's really the expert when it comes to decarbonizing basic material industrial processes. And I'm very pleased, I'm looking forward to your presentation, Karsten.
Thanks a lot for the invite, and very much looking forward to the discussion. So let me start with a short presentation. So for me, one of the key questions is really this: how do we decarbonize basic materials? And we've heard in Europe, cement is 4% of emissions. Globally, a lot more construction is happening. It's 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions relating just to cement production, chemicals, iron and steel, pulp and paper, aluminum. The basic material production dominates carbon emissions in industry. It's 60 or 70% of German industrial emissions, and globally, an even bigger share of total emissions that we have. So we need to find ways of addressing these emissions. And the one challenge we have in all of this process is that, first, it's new technologies. We've dealt with that in many contexts. But secondly, we have higher costs, which are, I would guess, there to stay compared to conventional processes. And there's a very simple physical reality behind it. We've seen how photovoltaic and wind power started to be cost competitive against coal or gas power, even without carbon prices in the energy sector alone. And therefore is spreading out across the world. And this is because we get directly the electricity that we use, and we are competing with coal power generation, where you afterwards only get 40–45% of the energy into electricity. If we go to basic materials, we have the opposite effect. Basic material production needs often this kind of carriers, energy carriers like coal or gas. And if we want to substitute coal or gas with electricity, then we perhaps use hydrogen. You lose electricity as we produce hydrogen, and then compete against coal or gas in, for example, steel making. So we have double penalty in terms of substituting coal or gas in basic material production compared to renewables. And that's why, even if renewables get a lot cheaper, it still is likely to remain more expensive to make steel and basic chemicals out of renewables than based on fossil fuels. And therefore, we need a setting to address these cost differences, to create a, sorry, it goes faster than I, to address this cost difference as we go forward. It's primarily higher operational costs, likely to stay there. But then a second effect, we do want to reduce the overall demand of basic materials, more recycling, more material efficiency. Because it's very energy intensive, we don't have that much energy available because of big resource implications, biodiversity and other elements. That means we need to substitute existing capacity and replace them at the time where they are written down. So we need to push somehow the new technologies into the market or get the others out. Carbon pricing certainly can make conventional technologies more expensive and therefore create this push opportunity. But an investor looks at the carbon price and sees, okay, I don't know, 50, 60 euro right now. Johanna can tell you the precise price right now better than I do. And anyone could look it up, so sorry that I didn't. But investors have seen over the last decade how prices go up and down with political regulatory changes. So they are somewhat concerned what will be the future of the price. And secondly, we continue to have free allocation of allowances primarily to conventional production processes to address carbon leakage concerns. We've agreed to phase this out, a schedule, and I'll come back to that in a second. But for the time being, conventional production is therefore subsidized, even if you have a carbon price. So against this, again, you have to make a business case for the clean technology. Hence, the idea of carbon contracts for differences. Friedrich will discuss them in more detail, so I just want to kind of show you the basic principle, which is to say an investor needs to know what is the carbon price he can see on the conventional technology that makes his new technology or her new technology cost competitive. So how can we give a guarantee for the next 10, 15 years or even 20 years for a project? And that's the idea of carbon contracts for difference, a tender where everyone participates, or technology-specific tender. Johanna will discuss this in more detail. And then you compete against others and say, I have the cheapest way of decarbonizing my sector. I need 70 euro per ton CO2 to get a clean production going. And if the carbon price is lower than this, you get a support up to 70 euro. If there's free allocation, this is being compensated such that you also benefit from this event. It's a deal which goes in two directions. If the price of carbon is far higher, then you pay back this amount to get back to the cost competitive outcome, so as to make it a fair arrangement for all, ultimately the taxpayers or consumers that have to pay for this cost difference here as well. Now, as we went into more details of assessing carbon contracts for differences and their quantifications, and Jörn Ristein and the team used to do lots of stuff since 2017 around this, we found one additional effect, which is very important. Steel prices, basic chemical prices, are globally determined in global markets. And they reflect the costs of making steel in global markets, particularly global coal prices. And steel prices go up and down with the global coal prices. If you now come into this market with a clean technology, unlinked to carbon coal costs, then it's sometimes you're lucky because coal prices are high and you make profits. In other years, you're unlucky because coal prices are low, steel prices are low, but you still have to buy electricity at another price level. And so what this German concept now reflects, that we have a hedge. You're hedged in this carbon contract for differences against the price gap between the clean technology and the dirty technology for the specific technology, so as to allow new technologies to enter the market where the product price is determined by the conventional technology. Otherwise, this creates a big market barrier for entry and would delay or increase the support costs to kind of get processes in here. And you can see here just the spread of uncertainty of the revenues in red without such a hedge, and how using the hedge we can kind of reduce the spread and therefore reduce the uncertainty market participants face in terms of revenue streams. And then you can translate this in terms of what is the carbon contract for difference price market participants would, in a competitive setting, bet to kind of pay for their installation. And you see in these green bars how by taking out some of these risks, we can reduce the required support hedge level, and therefore ultimately the cost to consumers and to the European economy, or any economy that wants to take forward clean technologies. We have, and this is my final content slide, one big challenge in this process. For the time being, we have largely free allowance allocations to this industry sector, basic material production. So we don't have auction revenues under ETS from industry, we only get auction revenues from allowances that are sold to the power sector. And the volume of them is needed for many activities. And the challenge therefore is, how do we pay for the incremental cost of a carbon contract for difference if we don't have the auction revenues in the system to pay for it? In Germany, we had the government now deciding we want to put quite a bit of money in this, 24 billion this year, as commitments for the coming years to fund the incremental cost. But market participants ask already, yes, I can do a project this year, but I have 3 furnaces. I want to kind of decarbonize all 3 of them. What do I do in 3 or 4 years' time? Will there be another tender? Does it make sense for me to build up the capabilities and capacity to actually meet this growing demand in the future? And without a dedicated revenue stream, we've seen in many other fields like renewables, it's difficult for governments to make their commitments. We have scarcity in fiscal space. And so we have this big challenge, how do we get this funded going forward? And in principle, we have a CBAM agreement that until 2034, we phase out the free allocation under ETS, and therefore would get increasing amounts of revenues after 2034. But we still have this funding gap. And therefore, the question whether we implement something that was assessed quite positively also by the European Commission in the early impacts assessment for the CBAM, a climate contribution, a charge per ton of steel, cement, basic chemicals produced in Europe or imported as an excise charge, which can be waived at the export side, so trade neutral, which would then raise revenues at the scale of 50 billion euro next year after year next year, and give us the revenue stream that is needed until we have moved to full auctioning. And therefore give confidence to market participants that we will be able to run future CCfD tenders to kind of scale up this technology, fill the funding gap of the Net Zero Industry Act at the European Union side. The distribution aspect is quite positive because rich people buy more cars and all the carbon material intensive stuff. So actually they have a slightly higher cost increase than poor people, but overall we're talking about 0.4, 0.5% for final products if everything needs to be decarbonized in this process, so viable. Concluding, we have a set of market failures and the challenge that without a strong carbon price reflected in product prices, it's difficult for the clean basic material production to come into the market. And therefore, the idea of a carbon contract for differences that the German government took forward, but also the Dutch have implemented something similar, and other European countries are right now in the process of discussing to cover these incremental costs. And so far, the process seems quite positive, and Friedrich will tell you far more about the details. The big challenge, how do we get dedicated funding streams to make it credible to market participants that it's worthwhile to scale up capabilities in the sector, and therefore the important need for the new Commission coming in now to tackle this, for example, with a climate contribution. Thank you.
Karsten, can you join me here? Is that okay? I feel lonely, and that's one thing. But also now, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, I just learned this morning that we have 2 hours, so we have a lot of time to chat on the technicalities, but then, you know, bring in the other perspectives. I want you, I have questions to Karsten, but if you have direct questions to this presentation, don't be shy, you can bring it in, and then we will continue with Friedrich later. So did I understand correctly, Karsten, that you said, well, in principle, I didn't mention that Karsten is also a trained physicist, right? So you know what you're talking about. You said, yeah, the laws of, I don't know, thermodynamics or whatever it is, basically tell you that these hydrogen procedures, etc. When you produce steel, cement with hydrogen, in the end, you can never be as effective as you can be directly with coal, for example. So in some sense, you said the cost will always be higher. Is that correct?
For steel and for basic chemicals, we have this challenge. In cement, we have a slightly different challenge, which is we need very high temperatures. And to get to very high temperatures, again, we cannot use heat pumps at that temperature level for the time being, but I'm not sure whether ever. And so again, we would need some kind of fuels, and again, therefore need to transform electricity into a fuel like hydrogen, and therefore again have the losses of the efficiency in there. While vice versa, the conventional processes directly build on gas or coal as a fuel they can directly use. So we really have an efficiency factor of 3 or 4 that we are disadvantaged in decarbonizing basic materials compared to decarbonizing electricity.
But that basically means that you would never get to this scenario where the producer has to pay the government because it depends on the CO2 price, really. So it all depends on the CO2 price, but in some ways, if we don't have a global CO2 price, if we don't have a global commitment to move towards carbon-free production processes. So as long as there's steel produced by coal, we will always have to somehow subsidize the production of steel that is decarbonized. Is that correct?
Well, in a simplistic economic model, we can have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And we wrote the first papers 2005, so I shouldn't be too critical, where you say we have a higher steel price in Europe, and as you export, you're subsidized for export, you're being refunded for the higher costs. But at the export level, that's difficult from a WTO perspective to implement. It's even more difficult to implement it where the higher costs are because of the clean process. And that's why with European lawyers and US lawyers together in this trade debate, we are proposing to say the combination of an ETS system with a free allocation as a carbon leakage mechanism gives you incentives to improve your efficiency. And you combine this then with a climate contribution so as to get the revenues and the incentives for the value chain, because everyone using steel or cement in Europe pays a higher price, so you want to be more material efficient. And the revenues then give you the revenues to fund the incremental costs of this clean process. And they fund it for domestic consumption, but also for exports. So it's a slightly tricky system, but in a world, as you know here at Hertie, where you have political constraints and legal constraints, sometimes the very simplistic economic approach doesn't work, and we have to kind of work slightly around it. But I think that is, for us, the vision we've been working on, to allow worlds with different levels of carbon prices to decarbonize in each region and have a strong incentive to work together, but not have the exposure that we have right now. Right now, Europe goes to the rest of the world and tells everyone, please implement carbon pricing and CBAM, because otherwise our industrial strategy doesn't work. And that's not a really good negotiation strategy we're in.
But I mean, what it shows is that all these innovation instruments, they're really challenging because they can distort trade, you can have trade disputes, you need CBAM, you need a CO2 price. So as long, I mean, and in a world where we have more and more conflict, at the same time, the problem is global, right? We do need global action and global solutions. So it's really, really, really challenging. Do we have questions from the audience to Karsten before I move to, yes, please.
Tobias here, TU Berlin. Thank you very much. For decarbonizing basic materials, can you give a rough assessment how large the percentage share can come from clean production versus substitution of carbon-intensive materials or sufficiency strategies?
So my guess has been for a long time, but I think that we've roughly three components. One is shifting primary production to clean production. Second one is enhancing circularity, using more of the materials again, over and over again, and therefore reducing import dependencies and the value chain benefits. And third, more efficient material use. So, and Julian Albert in Cambridge University, they made various studies across sectors and found you have 30–40% material efficiency opportunities. You have to go into entire design processes. For example, to think of what the building needs to do, and then think through the entire building, and then think about higher quality. But it was promising for me to see that in the competition between steel and aluminium, the automotive producers realized aluminium is lighter, and then the steel producers improved their materials, and with 15–20% less steel got the same quality out of it. So that is a third of the saving. I feel in many areas, perhaps not necessarily steel, another third comes from more circularity. And so ultimately, I don't think we need the full primary production capacity that we have right now, but only about a third of this production capacity.
Very good question, thanks. Are there more? In the back, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering, in the presentation it said that I think in a couple of years the phasing out slowly starts on the EU level. And I was wondering, given the recent elections, do you see that there's a chance that this further delays, and so the funding gap that you have with the carbon contracts of difference will also increase?
I think we've just discussed this beforehand in terms of where do we anchor our transformational policy. If we declare it as a purely climate policy, then I would fully agree with you. But actually, I guess many of you, we visited a lot of industrial companies, and for many of them, I felt it was interesting at the BDI Econsens conference. It was at a public panel even. Someone said, well, you can look at the beer glass half full or half empty, but it's actually more full already. Or many companies have committed their resources and their strategy towards decarbonization. And so actually for our country in Germany, if we delay, that's a really risky stuff. You can't do the conventional stuff anymore. You can't modernize conventional installations. You don't get funding from the banks. You don't get the technology anymore. So if you delay, you just really lose the jobs and the facilities. And therefore, it's an industrial strategy, a green industrial strategy, which would get backing from a far broader set of actors in the society than what you would get for purely a climate policy agenda. And therefore, I'm actually pretty optimistic that we get this implemented, but I still think we face a big communication challenge to really align these core objectives of the transformation such that it is clear what we are doing here is securing long-term competitiveness of our industry, securing jobs, addressing biodiversity challenges, and obviously getting the guidance, the very helpful guidance from the climate objectives.
I've got another question from online. Anonymous says, I think hydrogen is not a single silver bullet solution to decarbonize hard to abate sectors. Aren't we putting all eggs in a single bucket? What do you think about electrification of base material manufacturing? Government need to invest in researching into possibilities of electrification rather than focusing only on hydrogen.
I share the perspective that at the moment we are still in a somewhat hydrogen bubble, too much emphasis in many debates on hydrogen. I think it is an important technology. For example, in steel making, it's difficult. There is some direct electric reduction processes, but the technology readiness is far behind what we would need to kind of apply them at larger scale now. But you've seen the discussion on heat pumps I mentioned for many of the other processes, and I think they are far more energy efficient. You directly kind of get the multiplication factor of a heat pump and don't have the transformation losses towards hydrogen. So we have to be broader. We have to be really thinking about what's the outcome we're looking for. So ironically, I think often hydrogen is argued to be technology open, but often the proponents actually are slightly technology specific. And in many instances, I think we have to be broader again to think what is the most energy efficient way and therefore also long-term most cost competitive way in material production.
But Karsten, can I have a follow-up question? This CCfD, for example, it's not limited to hydrogen, right? You can also apply it when you electrify the production of basic materials.
The CCfD tenders in Germany are totally technology neutral. On the side, you have to kind of say what is the mitigation cost you have irrespective of what technology you use.
Niels, you had a question?
Only give the support if it's needed. Like you're mentioning the relation with the coal price, and they don't have the push when it's not needed because of the other prices.
I think as we are talking here about the challenge of higher operational costs, if you were to compensate higher operational costs with upfront subsidies, then you have risk-averse actors that anticipate what could be the incremental cost, and they could be quite high, and then you have to put a lot of upfront subsidies in there. And then also you get a challenge for smaller companies that have less opportunity to bear the risk. They have to bet for even higher upfront subsidies on this. And finally, you have the challenge, upfront subsidies are obviously directly on the balance sheet of governments, whilst the benefits come over the next 20, 30 years. So why not also spread the costs across this time period? So for the instance here, I feel it's a very important instrument for basic materials where the higher operational costs are present.
So, and I can feel we have a good atmosphere in the room, but also online. So I will now move to the next speaker, and you will have opportunities to ask Karsten and the others question. Just some rules of the game. I think we serve our online audience best if we wait until we get the mic when we ask questions in the audience. And do present yourselves because you have great questions. I'd like to know who you are. Okay? But for the moment, so a big hand first to Karsten, who will stay here with me. But this was already great and a good start. And now I want to ask Friedrich von Schönfeld on stage, and he will give us a presentation of the carbon contracts for difference as they have been designed and implemented in Germany. Friedrich is a policy advisor at the German Ministry of Economics and Climate Action. And he focuses on industrial policy and the decarbonization in particular. And he has always also experienced at the Federal Ministry of Finance, and he worked as a management consulting at McKinsey. So he knows many different fields and has a PhD from Oxford University. Friedrich. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak a little bit about our CCfD scheme. If you want to have one reason why you should work for the government, it's Karsten Neuhoff, because then you can work with fantastic people like Karsten. And it's really been a great pleasure designing and bringing the carbon contracts to life, because I think it started about 15 years in a research paper in the UK, and then Karsten's team took it over to Germany and did a lot of research on it, and then finally we said, okay, now it's there, and we should bring science or research into practice, and that's what we did in the last 2 years. And usually I speak a little bit more about the economics behind the scheme, but now thankfully Karsten did all that, so let me focus a little bit more on the technicalities and on the process. So the rationale behind the CCfD scheme is more or less what Karsten already, oh, we get there. Can you bring the news slide up? There it is. Okay, sorry, it just takes some time. Okay. So basically, we learned that the emissions from the industry are about between 20 and 25% within Germany, but also within the world. So if we want to get anywhere close to climate neutrality, you all know we need to do it together with the industry. And of course, Karsten already talked a little bit about the EU ETS price, which is our European solution to decarbonizing the industry. But if you increase the EU ETS price very quickly to a level where it would be a good business for every company to produce climate friendly, then of course they would have a competitive disadvantage and basically close down their factories at a large scale here in Europe and then go somewhere else and produce somewhere else in the conventional way, which would mean we not only lose jobs and business here in Europe, but also the CO2 will be emitted, but just elsewhere. So that was the basic problem we faced, and we also saw that that Karsten really put it wonderfully with the 2 slides of the CO2 price development and the energy cost development, that yeah, it is of course a little bit more expensive to switch to climate neutral technologies, but especially what is there in the way for financial investment decisions to be made is the uncertainty of how hydrogen prices will develop, how electricity prices will develop, and especially CO2 prices, of course. So this was one of the reasons we thought, we need another instrument. And the other one was, in the old days, which are still there, funding schemes usually work in a way that we as a government go to a company and say, okay, let's see, maybe you have a great decarbonization project, which is a multi-billion project for the company, and where they say, okay, we need some funding from you as a state as well. And then we try to understand as government officials for, I don't know, how their business works and what their business plans are for the next 10 or 15 years. And of course, they don't know themselves because they don't know how the CO2 price will develop. And we also don't know. And of course, if we want to do it at scale, it's just not feasible. So we learned, okay, we need something that is more easy for us and for them. And so our solution was that we cover both CapEx and OpEx cost, but also that we invent an auction-based system. And I think Johanna will also talk a little bit about that. That's the new game in town in the government within policymakers, that we say, okay, no longer we are going to try to understand your business plans for the next 15 years. And that probably takes us 2 years to understand per company, with lots of people who then try to become experts in steel, paper, glass, and whatever. No, we're just going to do it the same way that the business works, where we say we auction the funding that we have, and we don't care whatever you bid as a price. Just tell us what you need, how many euros you need to avoid 1 ton of CO2, and yeah, you can put in funny numbers. You can put a big margin on top, but if you're too cheeky, you'll just lose the auction. And yes, this will be a little bit difficult for you as companies, and we see this now. It is challenging for companies to come up with a business plan, as it always is, if you want to build a new facility, which is maybe 100+ million investment, but you just need to do it once, and then you go into the bidding, and we're not going to control you for 2 years or 3 years and check everything and then control everything again for the next 15 years. We just do it like in the private sector, that we do a simple auction and then you have it. Right. And I think Karsten already mentioned it a little bit, but what is there behind the there's actually, okay. What is the reason why we that's behind? What do we want to do with the CCfD scheme? And let me stay here on that page. It's not so much the avoidance of CO2 at the companies that we fund, right? This is, I mean, we talk about hundreds of millions of CO2 tons that we will take out through the CCfD funding scheme. But what we really want to do with it is we want to push the market transformation. We want new value chains to be created. We want to have new technologies that get created. We want to have banks that learn how to finance new technologies. We want to have markets where all of a sudden you have green products with a green premium, where it's worth producing and selling green products. And so with that, of course, we hope that in the industrial sector, we do the same that we've seen on Karsten's slide, that with the energy production cost, that basically production costs will fall, and at the same time, revenues will go up, and that's then the market transformation that we want to see. And our hope is that that then in the midterm, other companies can step in and then produce in a climate-friendly way without state funding. So just shortly on who is eligible to the CCfD scheme, it's basically all the big dirty 30 and plus whatever companies that we know, and the industrial sectors that emit a lot of CO2, like glass and ceramics, etc. Then we say, it's not just enough that you, I don't know, change one bulb in or all the bulbs in your building, right, and have some electricity gains. We really want to have something transformative going, because we want to push the transformation of the market. So you need to find a concept where you save 90% of the CO2 emission in relation to the best plants that we already have in Europe. And that, of course, puts a lot of pressure on companies to become very innovative, and that's exactly what we want. And then we say it's for big companies, because the CCfD scheme is just, they're not for the small bakers and, I don't know, handcraftsmen, but more for the real big dirty business. Now, I think I can go quicker over these slides, as Karsten already explained how the payout works. Basically, we compare the cost of the conventional plant versus the cost of the climate-friendly plant, and then the price difference is, of course, varies each year and maybe even each day, and our payments adjust accordingly, and that makes it more efficient for the state to fund, and for companies better. And let me tell you, from a policymaker perspective, it's really pain, right? If you don't get the funding right, and you never get the funding right if you want to control it yourself, you have two options. Either you get the funding too high, and then you create windfall profits, which is not good for the state and not good for the government, the taxpayers, but also not good for the competition. Or you get the funding too low, and then companies, after 1 year, come back to you and say, oh, we need more funding, right? So that's not a good situation, and that's the solution we wanted to achieve with that hedging, that dynamized cost. And here again, don't look at the left side. I just wanted to explain a little bit more in more detail how the funding works. Basically, we tell the companies, come up with whatever price you like. And in this example, the company says, yeah, it costs me 120 euros to avoid 1 ton of CO2. when I produce 1 ton of material. And then we say, okay, let's go and bid. And the company bids 120 euros, and we say, okay, maybe the company has a competitive bid and it wins the competition and it gets the contract. And then we say, okay, you don't get the 120 euros, of course, but what we do 2 things. First of all, we deduct the CO2 cost that you now don't need to bear anymore because you have climate neutral technology, so you have an advantage in relation to other technologies or companies who produce in the dirty way. So that's the blue line, the CO2 cost, which we deduct from the 120 euros. And we basically, and the second thing we do is what we already talked about, we dynamize the electricity or the hydrogen, whatever the cost of the energy. And that's the green line. And let's assume that actually, for example, hydrogen in this example might become less and less expensive. So the green line goes down and down and down. And at the same time, we have the CO2 price goes up. And then what we see is, so we pay always the difference between the green and the blue line. And then at the end, or hopefully not at the end, but in the due process, we come to a point where actually it becomes a viable business model because of the increasing CO2 price and the decreasing hydrogen cost to switch to climate neutral production. And that's then, of course, the moment where companies have a competitive advantage to produce in the climate friendly way. And that's where we say, okay, now it's our turn. Please pay whatever is whatever you have more in comparison to your competitors at the moment. And then we enter into that blue phase where actually companies can pay back. That's something pretty new in the policy area. I did it 3 years ago when we funded the Lufthansa. Maybe the Germans mightn't remember the case where we said, okay, we're going to help you with 9 billion euros, but we do it through funding instruments where we participate in case it goes well with you. And there was one of the learnings which actually worked pretty well, at least in the Lufthansa case. And we thought, you know, let's see how we can do other instruments and the CCfD funding. Right. So just to finish off, I'll give you a short idea of how the scheme works if you're a company and you want to apply, right? And each of you can apply and build your own company. We'd be happy. You know, we always like to see lots of innovative, great new bids. So the first thing you'd have to do is prepare and build your business case yourself. You know, how much will it cost you to produce in the climate neutral way? And then the second thing is, and this is here our timeline that we just ran through. We'll ask you what your project is, and you'll hand in some of the details, not all of the details, but some. And that then helps us, we did that in the summer 2023, and then that helps us to design the auction. And of course, we were already ready in December, but then we had some financing issues. So we only started in March, the auction, and now the auction is ongoing. And we have 4 months, and we are now in the last month. I can tell you, auctions are something only for people with strong nerves. And then at the end, so on 12th of this July, at midnight, we have a telephone conference, and then we open the bids, and we see whatever the companies bid and who's winning. And then we need some checks to make sure they're really good bids and they fulfill all the criteria. And then we sign the contract on our side, and then it's done. So it might be up to €1 billion funding that we have. So we put out 4 billion in total. There might be projects of 1 billion, and basically they bid. They take 4 months. Then we take a couple of weeks, and then we sign, and that's the funding. So that's how quick it goes. And that's something we hope to do again and again. It's, as Karsten said, a total novel idea to the world. And we hope to showcase that it's a good idea, that it works. But of course, I mean, from the beginning on, we were certain that we are making mistakes that we need to improve. But we said, you know, the best way to learn and to improve is to just do it. And so we did it. It's a pilot auction. We hope to learn, like Johanna will maybe explain on her scheme as well. I think that's something also very new in the policy area, that we just go and reiterate and do a first viable product and so on. And that's also our methodology. But of course, we need the funding. I really liked your funding idea. If you ask Robert Habeck or the ministers and Olaf Scholz, it's a little bit more tricky at the moment to get the funding. Let's see how we get there, but then we hope to already start the next auction in summer. Right, so that's it. Maybe in case you have more questions on the CCfDs, especially if they're really tricky, please don't ask me, ask the guys behind the email, because then they will need to answer the questions. And in case you want to learn a little bit more about the program, just visit our site with all the detail on the site.
Friedrich, you will get questions, including from me, so why don't you have a seat here? That was great, thank you. I mean, first of all, what struck me, and I didn't know, was that you said, Friedrich, you really worked with Karsten. So you wrote a paper, when was it, 15 years ago? And then you really worked on the scheme, and now it's being implemented. That must be very satisfying, no? That's not something economists see every day. So yeah, well, congratulations. And then how does it work in the ministry? So you thought, okay, we have to come up with a scheme here. And well, let's get some experts who have ideas that we can put to practice. And then you work together. How did it work exactly?
So pretty much like that, a little bit different. But so I was here in Berlin, and I was still working in the Ministry of Finance. And then I got a call from somebody in the Ministry for Economics. And he said, you know, don't you want to come over? You did that Lufthansa case and others, and you know, I heard from you, and we have that very interesting CCfD scheme that needs to be put in practice. Don't you want to do it? And I didn't need to think very long to decide and to go over. And then I think, Karsten, you had already worked with some other colleagues for 1 year or 1.5 before. And I said, you know, that's one of the reasons it's so great is it can be a win-win topic, right? It's good for the industry, it's good for our economy, it's good for the climate. So that's, you know, where do you have that, where it's good for climate and industry and so on. So that was great, and it was great to know that it's so deeply rooted in research. So what then, well, basically, my bosses told me there's one thing you need to do. It needs to be a CCfD scheme, and there should be some repayment, and now go and run. And so I looked around and I found Karsten and his team and also people from Fraunhofer, etc. And we built a team. We said, let's do it. And then I think with a bit of project management and research and so on, we built a team and we just ran and tried to get to where we are.
It sounds really great, but on the other hand, I mean, often these economic models and schemes, etc., they can be removed from market realities, etc. How did you work with industry a little bit to get some feedback whether this could actually work? How did you make sure that it's workable in the end?
So first of all, of course, you need to find experts who are not just in academics. It's always good to have people in academics and so deeply rooted like Karsten in academics, but who are also somehow attached to what's actually going on. And I think we were very lucky to have Karsten and people from Fraunhofer and others who know how the world is out there. And then, of course, as you said, you need to get a bit more into touch with the practice. And we onboarded some other consultants and lawyers who know a little bit more about how the business works in that sector. And of course, then we have consultation phases and so on, and you talk to associations and to companies, and you understand where their pain points are. Then you make a first discussion, first draft, and you discuss it with them. So it's rooted in research, but then of course you try to make something that works for everybody.
Did they like this from the beginning, or was there resistance against this sort of scheme?
I think they mostly liked it, yeah. I mean, first of all, if you tell companies they can get some billion euros, they always like it, right? But I think they really love the idea of the auction, and they really love the idea of the hedging. Then, of course, it's a little bit difficult to explain that to your CEO, especially if she's in the US, which is a challenge. But I think, yeah, at the beginning, everybody loved it. Yeah.
Can you explain the hedging again? I didn't fully get that. So that was against the swings of the carbon price. It was what you explained, the swings of the coal price.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me give you a very simplified version of how it works. Basically, we tell the companies, we guarantee you a CO2 price of 100 euros per ton. And then you give us your bidding price, which might be 120. And then we see every day how high the actual CO2 price is. And let's say at the beginning, it's at, like today, it's at 70. Then for today's production, we would pay you the 120 plus the difference between 100 and 70, which is 30. So we pay out 150. But then maybe, well, in a very simplified version, and then maybe one day the CO2 price goes up to 150, and then we say, okay, well, the price difference between 100 and 150 is minus 50, so we deduct the 150 from the 120, and that's how the simple version of it is. And then, of course, you come in with new energy carriers and so on, and there's some more detail to it, but that's the basic idea.
Okay. Did everybody get that? Any more questions to that? There's one in the back.
Yeah, I have kind of a twofold question. So the first one goes also a bit in the direction of auctions and decarbonization. So probably you know of this European Hydrogen Bank auction type of thing. And the question would be, I mean, it's slightly different in the way it works, but I would be interested in your opinion about it. Maybe the both of you actually, because it is rather close to the CCfD
I won't give
idea.
you the honest answer because Johanna is responsible for the hydrogen auction.
We will have a presentation about those things, so perhaps we can hold.
Okay, maybe then we'll
ask more
postpone it maybe a little.
I can give you the honest answer later on when Johanna doesn't listen.
So, but I have a question to you, Friedrich, actually. There's a saying that the energy-intensive industry will always be there where the electricity is cheap. And do you really think that CCfDs are going to keep the industry to a certain degree in Germany?
Yeah, that's of course the question that everybody asks. And maybe even more difficult, to what degree and where and which industry, right? And that's really, really difficult to decide and to answer. And again, we spoke to a lot of people and a lot of researchers to find out, what kind of industries are the ones, we need to decarbonize first and so on. And it is already, from a research perspective, really difficult to answer that question. And then if you come to a political sphere and you need to decide what kind of companies you need to decarbonize and where you say, this is not the future, this becomes a game that you can't really play in the political sphere. But in a way, our CCfD scheme is the answer to that, because we say, we as policymakers, we don't need to decide, you as companies decide, and whoever is the most innovative and needs the least amount of funding will get the subsidy and will be able to produce for the next 15 years plus. And then, of course, at the end, it's way more than just energy prices that keeps companies where they are. It's, we all know that from uni, right?
There's another question, but I want to follow up on that a little bit with you, Karsten, because from a research perspective, would you agree that, this type of auctioning, this is the search process with which you can find out which kind of industries would actually stay here, given that they have a reliable funding stream for some time and given the circumstances that they expect?
I think if you look at the funding guidelines, which are public as well, in principle, there is the opportunity to have differentiation by different sectors or by different product categories on the ETS. So as to make sure that not only an activity like cement, which we would anticipate to be perhaps lower cost in mitigation, but also others will succeed in taking forward decarbonization. And as we want to go to climate neutrality, all sectors need to get the technologies right and move forward there. So I think this differentiation has not in the first round, it's a pilot round, been implemented now. Now it's the competition amongst everyone at the same basis. But I think something like this may be necessary in the future to make sure that we get different technologies going forward. We know it from renewables, that we have different price levels for tenders for wind and solar, because there are different elements and state aid guidance allow for this. So I think it's a process of searching and of introducing an instrument that is not too complicated at the beginning, but perhaps refining over time. But give me one chance to kind of retaliate for all the friendly words which gave me really red ears earlier on. Because what I feel is just as important, or even more important than good research from the outside, is actually policy entrepreneurship within institutions. Because as Friedrich hinted at, any new element that comes into a political process gets a lot of criticism from everyone around who is covered, touched by it, or who doesn't fully understand it. And obviously it's difficult to explain everything to everyone who has some stakes in these processes. And secondly, inherently, like for conventional funding processes, there's a risk aversion. If the process goes bad, you're in trouble. If it goes well, it's just another thing that goes on afterwards. And so actually standing up for a simple instrument to make sure that this process can go forward, and the tendency, for example, of any funding agencies to say, have safeguards in there. To have, let's check the procedures, let's check that the bids are not too far outrageous, let's check that we, look, where do they spend the money, which would really complicate such a process. So you can imagine that that probably requires quite a lot of internal negotiations and someone who takes forward the lead on these processes. So I think inside institutions, it's just as crucial for transformation to succeed. I hope the second or third application, once you have international experience, you can draw from this country that has done something and say, look, they've done it and here's how they've done it. So that should be easier, but getting the first experiences and examples and testing something out, I think is really crucial. So given that people of you might go to government, just as challenging of an opportunity to take forward.
You probably wanted to say between the lines that Friedrich is a great institutional innovator, right?
Indeed. Thanks for making that explicit.
There's a question here. Do you still have your question? No? Okay. Then you were next, I think. The lady in white.
Thanks. I'm Luca Fischer from TU Berlin. I was wondering, so in case 2040 Europe kind of realizes that they've been decarbonizing far too slowly and the ETS price is really high, and then there's a political majority to give the ETS a lot more slack again, that will be the risk that then Germany would continue to finance the carbon contracts for difference and the companies wouldn't be paying back. What is the German discretion there? What would they be able to do in such a situation?
Yeah, that is the risk, but that is exactly the risk that why companies don't invest into clean technology. So we said, okay, we'll take that risk. And we are full there. So it can be that the CO2 price is too low and we need to pay a lot. But from a political perspective, and I think this here in Head School is always great to look from also political perspectives on issues. At the moment, we have a lot of companies that have big interest in keeping the CO2 price low. But the more companies we get funded through the CCfD scheme, the more companies will get disinterested and will lose interest in the CO2 price. So we have less and less, the more and more we fund through the CCfD scheme, the less and less the political pressure gets to have a CO2 price very low. Do you understand? Is that clear? Right, sorry. So also from a political perspective, it's nice to just get companies out of that that need to have a low CO2 price.
Actually, is that true? Because if they operate within a CCfD scheme and the CO2 price rises, they might have to repay at some point, right? Or did I get that wrong?
Yes, but at the same time, they have a competitive advantage against their competitors, who then have higher cost. So for them, it's okay.
One last question here from the audience, and one more in the back. But then, did you still have your question? Are you fine?
Can I read out one online question?
Sure. So
Yeah?
we will take 3, but then we move to your question, which was about the European auction too.
And take
Please
some
go.
time for Johanna, because she has really interesting stuff.
Yeah, but we do have time.
Great. So Julian Parodi from Epico is asking, how can we ensure that Germany does not attract companies from other EU countries, creating a two-speed Europe while hurting EU general interest? What do you think of European CCfDs?
So Johanna and I always, it's great that we are here in the panel again together. We spoke in the last 2 years very frequently, and Johanna always said, how's your CCfD scheme going? And I was like, how's it going in the EU? And yeah, we hope that it would be created on the EU level. And I think we're not quite here yet. I'm interested to hear from Johanna her perspective after the election. But yeah, we really wanted to showcase with our German scheme that it's an instrument that's worth exploring, and I think maybe they're working on EU level on it. Yesterday we spoke to Japan. Within Europe, France is just starting the first procedure. Austria has done it. Denmark is on it. Sweden is interested. Spain is on the research level already. We speak to South Korea, who are really interested, to the US, to Canada is very far. So everybody's kind of coming to us and trying to see how the scheme works. So let's hope it really works with the bidding, and then it's more a showcase and a push for other countries to go into the funding.
Your question, Niels, if you can hand over the mic.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Davide. I wanted to ask, well, one question is, how can you prove that this scheme is actually working? So what are the metrics that you're going to look at, and how long it takes to get some data that can tell you, okay, we go in the right direction? And sorry, second question, also kind of going to that direction. Do you see this event, do you see this instrument could become an instrument that is actually traded on the market? Could be for publicly, like a bond-ish kind of thing, or is it something that is, the question goes into direction, say, how do you make this instrument sort of financially sustainable without continuously sort of funding from governments?
Wow, interesting question, yeah. So, sorry, the second question was so interesting, I forgot your first one. The metrics, yeah, correct. So exactly, yeah. So already on July 12th, we'll open the bids, and we'll learn so much about decarbonization and how much it costs, and how cheeky some companies are, and how honest others. I don't know. We'll see. So that's already the first thing, and I think already in the process we've learned a lot, right? If you tell companies that here are some couple of billion euros for you to come up with transformative ideas, then all of a sudden, companies start to think about how they can decarbonize. And sometimes companies only through that process discovered that they can already do some decarbonization that's already a positive business case. So I think there's a lot that we understood already from the projects, but project or companies understood from the way so far. And then with each auction, we get more and more intelligent how the costs are. And I think then in the due process, companies need to report a little bit, not very much, a little bit. And I think we'll become more intelligent on that as well. And to your second question, I've never thought about it, but actually, yeah, what we want to do is a finance instrument on ICE side, right, and oil ICE level, and I think we won't be able to sell it on the market. I'd really love that, because at the end it is a funding scheme. So we expect to fund, or at least on the basis of Karsten's models, we expect that we will fund a lot more than we will get in return. So yeah, but why not? We could maybe sell it to negative prices on the market. I'll think about it.
Well, at least this is really the elephant in the room, right? Like you said, Karsten, for it to work over the long term, you need to have reliable funding. If we don't have funding through ETS auctions or the CBAM, then, you know, with situations like in Germany, it may not be very convincing that the funding will be there in the long term, right?
I think two parts. First, the projects that win in the tender now, for them there's a public guarantee, it's a contract, and they could go to court with this contract. So they will be funded, and that's why the government has put in provisions already that they have the funding available in the future to pay for it. But we know all technology is not just the project, but it's the providers of the technology that develop the technology. And therefore the question, what will be the funding for new tenders to run in 2 or 3 or 5 years? And that was the dedicated question of dedicated funding stream. And the question where the characterization from Friedrich showed, which countries in Europe seem to have the fiscal space to run CCfD tenders now? And you didn't see any Central European countries mentioned by him or anyone right now. And for me, one of the main challenges, coming back to the other question, is really, how do we make this a European transformation? Europe was founded as the European Community on Steel and Coal. It's actually the center of where we're coming from, ironically. That's now precisely the kind of topics that we're talking around. And if we only decarbonize in the next 5 years, primary production of basic materials in Western European countries, and then we know we have to reduce the overall production volumes of primary production because we have recycling and material efficiency, then we will close down the facilities in Eastern European countries or countries that don't have the fiscal space to do that now. And that's for me one of the key challenges for the integration of Europe, because you can imagine from any of the countries, if at the core of the industrial region the primary production processes would vanish, that's really tough politically for Europe as well. And that's why I think we need to have the funding stream to take it forward. Nevertheless, and that comes to your second question, if you allow this one to pick it up, this carbon contract for differences is a long-term contract at a scale where I don't see private companies to underwrite it, because the biggest thing behind it is regulatory risk. What will be the carbon price in the future? And you all now know how difficult it is to hedge regulatory risk in the market because it's difficult to assess. It's really expensive to hedge that in the market. And therefore, I think it will remain something governments have to underwrite, and ultimately national governments. So we need to have a funding stream that all countries can take forward in Europe, but to some extent the bigger scale things on the CCfD part, I think will remain linked to national government type auctions, harmonized, integrated across Europe, learning from each other, perhaps even price levels and so on. But ultimately, it's also national governments involved in this. And this specific instrument cannot be traded, I would think. But it gives the opportunity to a lot of other elements around it to be traded for example, flexibility we can go to afterwards. So it's an anchor point.
I had one last question in the back. Please keep it.
Can you hear me?
Succinct.
Yeah, perfect. Just maybe shortly concerning the eligibility for the CCfDs, could you describe a little more what you considered like a transformative process? Like for instance, if like a chemical company wants to have like green ammonia, let's say, and then they decide to build like an on-site electrolyzer to have green hydrogen and so on, is it still considered as a transformative process?
Probably yes. So we try to put up as few criteria as possible for defining what a transformative process is. We basically say it needs to be able to achieve a 90% reduction in comparison to the best facilities in Europe at the moment, which already pushes company to the edge of becoming very innovative. And then we said, it needs to also showcase that there is something more that creates technologies like electrolyzers or that creates infrastructure and so on. So, for example, there is a simple fuel switch, for example, where you just use natural gas and then you maybe put in just green natural gas or green gas or synthetic gas or something. There, you exchange methane through methane, it's all the same. You don't create much in Germany, so that's a point where we would probably say that's not transformative.
Thank you.
So Karsten got a hand, so maybe we can have one for Friedrich as well, intermediate one. And now we're moving, we talked a lot about her, Johanna. Johanna Schiele will join us and give a presentation on the EU auction schemes. And Johanna is, works at DG Climate on exactly these EU-wide auctions and new funding instruments at the EU Innovation Fund. And she was previously in the power sector and a researcher on auctions and clean tech funding, so she really knows what she's talking about. She also BA from Oxford University and an MPA from Harvard. Johanna, we're really looking forward to what you're going to tell us.
Thanks a lot. Let's see if the slides come up. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about something that's slightly different from the CCfDs that we've heard about so far. It's still an auction, but it's not an auction for contracts for difference or carbon contracts for difference. It's an EU-wide auction, not a national auction, for the production of renewable hydrogen. So maybe first, why is it not a CCfD? We've been talking a lot about CCfDs. And what is the tension between the European level and the national level? So also on the European level, we have created a legal base to do European-wide carbon contracts for difference, so something that's really industry neutral and tackling all types of decarbonization projects across industry. But this is where first best and second best immediately diverged. The Commission made a budget proposal to increase the funding of this one instrument called the Innovation Fund that's doing these type of programs. And already here, it becomes very clear that the EU is different from a member state because we cannot tax. The EU can't levy taxes on its members. You don't have an EU tax on your bill. So the revenues that we have, they come, for example, from the ETS, but most of these revenues go back to the member states already. So we can have a bit of a discussion later on your funding proposal of the ETS resources and the CBAM resources. Already today, a big majority of that goes back to member states. And then a very small fraction goes into EU-wide programs. And we proposed to double this one program from 40 to 80 billion, and we didn't get it through the council. So we didn't have the political backing to get a lot more money for this EU-wide program. So we had to do something slightly smaller, and this something slightly smaller was an EU-wide auction for renewable hydrogen production. Why hydrogen? We heard it before, hydrogen is an energy carrier that's used for lots of decarbonization processes in industry, and we thought that this would be a really nice testing ground to try the first ever auction on the EU scale. So what were our design objectives when we started to design this? First of all, we want to reduce the cost gap between renewable and fossil hydrogen, and we want to reduce it over time. So that's to the point of you can't subsidize something forever. At some point, you've got to stop. It's got to become cheaper, and it's got to work on its own in the market. So this is clearly a long-term objective of the scheme. The second objective, and I think that's almost as important or maybe more important than actually getting the money out of the door, is to allow for price discovery and market formation. Renewable hydrogen is not, or hydrogen in general, is not a globally traded commodity, or not even a commodity that's traded across Europe. So we don't actually have a uniform price for hydrogen across Europe. We have lots of bilateral over-the-counter contracts where no one really knows how much anyone's paying, and the price also probably deviates from region to region quite a lot. So what we set ourselves as a goal is to make as much data as we're legally allowed public after the auction, and to allow for more transparency and price discovery so that in the medium term we're moving towards a proper market for hydrogen. Then the third objective relates to the first one. It's making stuff cheaper, and a big factor in making stuff cheaper is reducing the capital costs for the product. And what we wanted to do is to guarantee a safe revenue stream for the projects, so that the weighted average cost of capital, or the cost for the project to raise capital in the private market, goes down. And this is what we call de-risking, and we hope that it leads to projects becoming cheaper just through the fact that the capital for the project becomes cheaper. And then the last one, I think that's also really important in relating to this element of policy entrepreneurship, is we want to reduce the administrative burden for companies that have to apply to these programs, because there's a ton of funding programs on the national level, on the EU level. There's a whole army of consultants that do nothing else than advising companies on how to apply to these programs. And that's maybe not the optimal situation. So it's neither optimal for the ministries, because in the ministries there's a lot of bureaucrats like me who try to assess, is this a good project or is this not a good project? But in the end, the company always knows more, and we got to be realistic about that. If you start negotiating with a company with a huge corporate law department and an army of technologists and people who have the goal to maximize profit, and you're 2 or 3 people in the ministry and you try to assess what does the cost structure really look like, it's a bit of an uneven challenge. And I think addressing that challenge in a structural way is a really smart idea, and that's why an auction can be a really smart idea. And also, of course, the application shouldn't consume a lot of resources at the company, and we also want that innovative smaller companies, startups, SMEs can apply. If they have to write a 600-page application, it's probably already over for them before they start. Now, what do we actually auction? I think there's 2 interesting questions here. One is, what is the mechanism through which you distribute the public funding? And then the second question, what form does the public funding take? And in the cases we talked about before, the public funding takes the form of a for-difference payment. So it's variable, it changes over time, and it relates to some fluctuating market reference price. We actually opted against that, and what we're auctioning is a fixed premium. So we are auctioning off a fixed premium per kilogram of renewable hydrogen produced over a period of 10 years. And from an economist perspective, this is not the ideal thing to do. The ideal thing is a for-difference premium where you adjust to the market. But we discussed this for a long time, and we actually made quite a conscious choice not to begin with that. We might move to it in the future, but we're not beginning with that. And the reason for that, okay, one reason was speed. It was really important to do it quick and to get experience with starting with an instrument rather than waiting a year longer to have something that's slightly more complicated. But another reason is also you have to look for every product at the market of that product. And for hydrogen, when we spoke to the banks, what we heard is actually the offtake contract, so the buyers of that hydrogen, they mostly want pretty much baseload fixed price hydrogen. That's not the case for everyone, but it's the case for many of the off-takers. And if your revenue side is looking pretty stable, then actually a fixed premium auction becomes identical to a for-difference auction, because it's not just your benchmark price that's stable, that's determined through the auction, but it's also your reference price that's pretty much stable. And this is why we went for the simpler choice. We hoped it would be easier to understand and to rely on for banks and for project developers. And once we have a hydrogen reference price, once that starts to become a traded good and we have a liquid reference price, then we can move to a CFD, because then that starts to make sense. And a big question here is also infrastructure, because without hydrogen pipelines, you can't really trade hydrogen, because you can only deliver it where you can get it to, and that's usually a very limited area around where it's produced at the moment. So the budget in this first auction, which we already ran, and I'm going to get into results in a second, was 800 million, and we're already going to run a second round this year with 1.2 billion. So the first round worked, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the results now. In this first pilot auction, we received 132 bids across Europe. Our success KPI was to receive at least 40 bids, so that's really nice. It was a lot of competition, and the more competition you have, the more you can expect that the price that's revealed through the auction is actually the cheapest one you could get. We are able to spend 720 million out of these 800 million budget for the pilot. Why is there remainder? Basically because the last project or the marginal project just didn't fit inside the budget anymore, and we roll over the remainder to the next round. And the clearing price in this auction was 48 cents per kilogram of hydrogen, and that is incredibly low. We talked to lots of people before. We simulated the auction with the help of Fraunhofer colleagues and some other third parties as well. And I think everyone expected this price to be higher. From we talked to other colleagues in the German ministry as well, and there was like, maybe 3 euros, maybe 4 euros. So this is really low. And I think what this reveals is that competition on the EU level has big advantages because you significantly increase the pool of projects that bid, and you can really tell a lot of regional differences, but this is also what makes it hard, and maybe we can get into a discussion on that as well, because what you see here, most of the bids come from the Iberian Peninsula and Scandinavia and Germany, because Germany put an additional budget up for grabs just for German budget projects in this auction, but I'm going to talk about that in a while as well. The winners, we had 7 winners, they all come from the Iberian Peninsula or Scandinavia, and this reflects the project economics. But it's too easy to say it's just about the power price. So for a hydrogen project, roughly 60 to 70% of the project costs are OPEX, it's operating costs, it's the cost of the power you need to put into the electrolyzer. And the rest is CAPEX, and in these bids it also really matters how much the off-takers are willing to pay, because your bid should be roughly your levelized cost of hydrogen minus your revenues. That's a rational bidding strategy. So there's lots of factors that affect these bets, and this is my favorite chart of the whole auction. And it was a real fight to be allowed, for us to be allowed to make that public. We basically made the whole bid curve public. And here you can see that also from countries where you would expect that it's a bit more expensive to produce hydrogen, like Germany, for example, because the power price is quite high. Germany is this mint green color in the chart. You actually see a lot of bids under €1 that are really competitive. And that's a really nice surprise to see. That's also a really nice surprise for Germany. What you can also see is that this bid curve is pretty smooth. It's pretty continuous. So the 7 very cheap winners, they're not outliers. They're really part of a whole range of projects that managed to bid quite cheap. And since the day that we published these results, there was a lot of speculation on how it can be this cheap. Are projects taking strategic losses to bid into the auction? Are they saying, I'm rolling a loss on my balance sheet because this is the first project I'm building, I want to build capacity, I want to be in the news, I want to be the first? There's lots of potential reason for why projects bid the way they do. But that's also really important for us, is we leave the bidding strategy totally up to the projects. We don't enforce a specific NPV or IRR that the project economics has to achieve. We really leave it up to them. And we say, business risk, project management risk, construction risk, that's something that the private sector is able to handle much better than us. So why would we micromanage these elements? And I think that's also a hands-off, quite risky approach in a way that there can be surprises. But the surprises is almost what we do it for, because we learn a lot from them. And we learn a lot about where the sector's at and why companies think it makes sense to bid that low. I'm not going to go through all of the result slides because I would love to leave some time for discussion instead, but you can find all of the results of this auction on our website, DG Klima Innovation Fund. There's a lot of data out there. I think it could also be potentially quite interesting for research. We had lots of requests from universities and research groups already on the data from this auction. And we're now also publishing this data to improve the auction design for the second round, which will be launched at the end of this year. We do a lot of stakeholder consultations. We really speak to industry at every stage to ask what worked, what didn't work. Obviously, everyone wants more money, and we're not just going to give them what they want, but we want to hear on the details what has worked, what can make it more efficient, what can mean that with every euro of ETS money spent, we can get more emission savings in the end. Maybe one more chart I want to focus on is this one. This is politically also quite sensitive because there's 2 aspects to funding green projects in Europe. One is obviously you produce a product like hydrogen or steel or chemicals or whatever it might be, but you also use a lot of equipment to produce that product. And the question is increasingly, where does the equipment come from? Because we lost the solar industry almost entirely to China. Solar panels are almost exclusively manufactured in China or Asia. And we see increasing trends, batteries already, cathodes, anodes, PCAM materials, mostly produced in China as well. So this discussion on where does the value add of public money in an auction like that actually go if a big fraction of the project cost, equipment cost and capex, makes this question really important. And also here it's nice to have transparency. So out of 132 bids, we saw that more than half intend to procure the electrolyzer, the machine needed to produce the hydrogen, inside the EU, which is really encouraging. Then further 30 are mixed EU and other, and these are mostly companies that have a seat in the US and in the EU, and it's unclear yet which manufacturing site they will use. And then out of 132, 20 companies intend to procure their electrolyzer from China, some from the US, some from India. So having that data is also really interesting and can inform other policy areas like trade policy or competition policy. Very last slide, and then I'm going to stop. How much is industry willing to pay? This is also an interesting data point, because when you have a bid like also in the CCfDs, what you're covering is the cost gap between the production cost and the willingness to pay from the guys who buy that product. And hopefully you would see some green premium or some willingness to pay more because the product is green. But no one really knows how big this green premium is. So having an auction where bidders need to put in an assumption on the revenues that they're able to achieve with their product gives you a very good idea of how much more off-takers are willing to pay for that because it's green. And here, if you have a look at the top right chart on this graph, the median expected off-take price for off-takers in industry was around €5.70 across the EU, across all bids. And the willingness to pay across mobility off-takers was over €8. And this is really high given that the cost of grey hydrogen is maybe at €3. So they're really willing to pay a lot more. And again, it's a big question, is that because these are the first off-takers and this is really the crème de la crème, these are the guys who are willing to pay the most, but how deep is this expensive demand? And this is something we're only going to see over time. As we do multiple rounds, we discover which fraction of the market is willing to pay this much and when does it start to drop because they simply can't afford and gas is just much cheaper. And yeah, this allows you also to analyze demand and supply elasticities, and it's really a lot of valuable information that's almost as valuable as being able to fund these projects.
Thank you, Johanna. Thanks a lot. Actually, I have to admit I don't get the last slide. So first of all, I don't know what you mean by industrial off-taker. So what is that actually? And I hope I'm not the only one. If everybody Googled the slide, then I take back the question.
So we don't tell these hydrogen producers who they have to sell to. They can sell to anyone. And we clustered them in industrial consumers. So that's, for example, a steel plant or a synthetic fuel plant. If the fuel is not for transport, if it's methanol or it's something that goes into a chemical application, or mobility off-takers. So that's for hydrogen and mobility, shipping, aviation, etc.
So basically the next step in the supply chain. You can observe that and then you know, and it's still more expensive even with your auction subsidy, it's still more expensive than gas. So you kind of know what's the willingness to pay for a decarbonized production process.
Yes, exactly.
Questions from the audience? Many. Good. Here's one. Gentleman with stripes, and then behind him, and then there was a lady there.
Thank you Thank you so much, Johanna. This was super exciting. I love the work that you do at the Commission. One question I have, regarding the last slide where we see the median prices. Is there a particular difference between the projects that are below that median price and above? Is there like certain similarities that really you found are similar among the bidding, the winners of the auction, and the projects that kind of get below a bid of €1, let's say?
Yeah, great question. So I can't tell you so much about the winners because we also have to keep their commercial secrets and we have to ask for their permission to divulge a lot of details about the winners. But we did correlate the prices with a lot of factors that we thought could influence them. And I think on average, across the data that we have, and that's not the whole hydrogen economy, it's not necessarily fully representative, just big caveat here. We tend to see that smaller projects tend to be a bit more expensive than larger projects, and that projects that have to price storage and transport infrastructure in are obviously more expensive than those who don't. So the cheaper ones tend to be the ones where production and consumption is co-located in a similar region. And I think that really highlights that we have to build pipelines, we have to build infrastructure to transport that hydrogen around and to, I mean, it's a big thing to say, it's really expensive. Infrastructure planning is very hard. You lock yourself in for a long time. But especially in these corridors, for example, from Rotterdam down to the industrial area in Ruhr area, Netherlands, Belgium, there's some areas where it might make sense to start with a backbone grid and to start being able to trade a little bit and to have more than one off-taker who also takes risk out of the project, because if your one buyer goes bust and you have no one else you can deliver the hydrogen to, that's a huge off-take risk, and that's something that banks also really look at.
Thanks. Behind you. Just hand over.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Super interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could put the amounts of hydrogen a bit in perspective. So if I understood the cost curve correctly, for the 800 millions, you got 2 megatons of hydrogen. And if we took all the 130 bits together, it was around 8 megatons. So what is the expected demand of hydrogen in 2030 in the EU? And you think there is enough out there that we can meet this?
So I don't have the modeling figures front of mind actually on expected demand, but the indicative targets from the Repower EU plan is to have 10 million tons of EU domestic production and 10 million tons of imports by 2030. So you can see that we're quite far from that. But we also don't intend to subsidize all of those targeted volumes through this instrument. That's impossible. The money comes from a fund called the Innovation Fund. It's not the Hydrogen Fund. We cover a lot of other industries as well. So our goal is not to reach these targets with just the Innovation Fund money. Our goal is to kickstart the market and to make it cheaper, and then to hopefully draw other funding sources in as well. And a great example of that is Germany, because they were a little bit, not a guinea pig, but they were really bold in joining us already in this first auction round in a concept called auctions as a service, where we said, we put a lot of work into designing this auction. There's no point in having 27 different member state specific hydrogen funding schemes plus a 28th European one. It's just complicated and a mess for everyone. So we gave it as an option to member states to, rather than designing something new on the national level, to channel funds through this auction and to get automatic state aid clearance in return, because this auction is state aid compatible by design. And Germany took the leap and did it in the first round already with 350 million euros for German projects. The results of that are not yet public, and we're already working on how we can improve this auctions as a service scheme for the next round. But for this year, we already have more interest from more countries. So hopefully we can channel more funds that are not European funds through this tool, because our money is very limited.
But I have more questions from the audience, but here I have two follow-up questions really. So one is, doesn't that relate a little bit to the dangers that you were discussing before, Karsten? So okay, I understand the concept of auction as a service makes a lot of sense, but then if Germany ships in money that can only go to well, I don't know, German companies or projects in Germany, and other member states don't have the means, right, that already, well, can create a lot of political tension. It can, lead to deindustrialization in some regions where you really don't want to have it. Well, you don't want to have it anywhere, really. So isn't that a danger? And my second question is, so this was, okay, I understand it's just a pilot, you want to learn, etc. But we talked before about hydrogen, technology neutrality. I think the CCfD is kind of designed to be technology neutral. So why did you decide to have a hydrogen auction specifically? If you could have opted for something that's more wider or technology neutral, whatever.
Yeah, maybe first on your first question. So I think that's a really tricky question because we have two things going on. One is Europe needs to be competitive as Europe against global competition. And if you just take that lens, then really you should be producing energy intensive goods in those regions in Europe where the energy is the cheapest. And that's what maybe enables us to be competitive with goods produced in Texas or in China or somewhere where there's a lot of PPAs and a lot of cheap power. But I think that perspective is too short because we have a lot of existing industry and a lot of existing jobs and a lot of political constraints also around that industry and those jobs. And here different actors also have different roles. So my role at the EU is to make sure that we don't forget this European competitiveness angle, and that's why we spend our money on the cheapest project wherever they are in Europe, and we don't have a regional quota, and we don't say we reserve this many million euros for Germany and this many million euros for France, etc. But we really look where are the projects in Europe that are the most competitive. But on the other hand, we know that member states have a very different perspective, and here we're trying to find a solution that's better than pure competition or subsidy race between different member states. We try to say at least we have the same design and the same price discovery and all of the price points that come out that are comparable, and they give us good data on the market and help us develop that market. Plus we put something called an exogenous ceiling cap on the German window, which means that German projects under this extra German budget could only be a factor 3 more expensive than the cheapest European one. And that was actually really biting. So that was a biting constraint in this auction. So we tried to do a middle ground between subsidy race member state against member state and only EU competition compared to global competition where it's very clear where the cheapest power is, because I think we have to solve both problems. But it's tricky.
I'll bit on that one. I'll come back to the first question because Karsten, I would like to ask you. So, I mean, Johanna, she explained very well, you know, her role in some ways as a commission officer is to make sure the EU is competitive. And then on the other hand, these regional concerns, she said, can be brought in. Well, she was trying, or the EU was trying to find a balance. But to me, it sounds as though either you're competitive or you have deep pockets. And then there are regions who will be neither, right? So how do we solve that?
I think for me, the one additional dimension that perhaps can be helpful is that we are now talking about a transition to climate neutrality, and it's increasingly becoming clear we have to have some vision how this goes forward, what will happen in certain regions. So we started 10 years back to say climate targets, or 20 years back, emission targets and pathway for the emission targets. Now we have an EU 2030 governance, which already outlines what are my plans in my country, how much progress do we want to do. We've just had a debate in the global stocktake under the UNFCCC process, where it's emphasized it's not only about emissions, but about the core benefits of such a transition in terms of jobs, in terms of biodiversity, employment, all the elements that come together. All the elements that are crucial for our parliamentarians to go out to win votes in the public debate. And ultimately, that's the basis of our democracy. So we cannot talk about this transition as something that's disconnected from our democracy. And I think in our democracy, we can only talk about this vision if we really clearly point out what do we want and have a debate around this. Otherwise, we leave it to the extremist parties to say, I want the future that looks like the past. And they can paint this future. And everyone else is left to say, I want the market to decide about the future. I can't tell you what it is. I think that's really putting policymakers in a tough position and parliamentarians in a lost position. And that's why I think it becomes clearer that we need clarity in terms of what is this pathway? What share of our basic material production do we want to move to climate neutral processes? How rapidly do you want to phase scale up circularity as perhaps our two key metrics for industry. And if we have that metric, then it becomes clear this is a metric that should probably apply to each member state. And then it gives, if we make this as a political commitment, then it gives Johanna a lot more guidance in her role how to balance these European and national interests in a way that both need to be addressed. But ultimately, it's clear that it is not only an innovation instrument that we are talking about in the long term. I think kickstarting something is helpful, but it's a transformational pathway. And then we need to look at terms of what is it that we do to manage this transformation in a manner that addresses Friedrich's concerns. I don't want to be in a position to say how much money every industrial player gets, but can we do it differently in a way that we have some price discovery processes? And I'm not sure these price discovery processes will work in every member state. The smaller the country, the more difficult to tender. But perhaps we can learn sufficient information to then say, actually, if you're in a very small member state, then you still use the price discovery point that was discovered across these international tenders, and that also applies to your country. And then the firm in the country can, as a take or lose it opportunity. If you want to maintain the production, here's a contract at that price, and you can take this forward as well. And we need to back it then with a revenue stream that is relevant for this country. And that's coming back to the earlier point then. But I think somehow we are in the space right now of shifting from only innovation towards transformation. And suddenly I think have very different policy debates. And based on these policy debates only, you can then actually at the technical level implement something.
So in some ways you're saying in order to have a transformation that really takes people, regions along, etc., you need to have something, you have to move beyond the market, not just saying, okay, I'll let the market decide, but you say, okay, I have a vision, I have sort of some quotas, this is how much I want to have circularity come in, this is how much I want to produce still in the European Union, because otherwise people don't know what to expect. Is that the...
I was impressed when Habeck was presenting this carbon contracts for differences, very well briefed by Friedrich and others, because he could explain it far better and far more empathetically to say, what is the purpose of this instrument? And he succeeded, and you recall all the debates in Germany, to take forward an instrument that spends at first 4 billion and still in the back pockets announced 20 other billion euro in Germany this year. So that clearly was possible, not only as a climate objective, but because he could link it to a broader industrial objectives or job objectives in the country. And so I think that's what we need to do for this transition to succeed, particularly now also with this new commission coming in Brussels. I don't think we can only play the climate card for the transformation. We really need to link it to the core benefits that come with this transition. And then we need to explain it. And at the end we need to, because if we run these tenders, these are billions of euros, not spent this year, but over the next 15 to 20 years. So that's actually a commitment our government now takes for the next 15 years. And that's something I don't want any government to do without a good understanding in the public. That's what we're up for, and that's why we want to do it. So that's why I think we need to have this discussion also for our democratic purposes, such that things go good or bad, we know that's what we jointly decided to go down this pathway.
And I think, well, Niels, you have a question there, but we had one question. You had a question, right, Johanna?
Yeah, I'll do.
You're going first, and then Johanna. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's another question online again from Julian Parodi from EPICO. So do other states besides Austria and Germany plan to do some sort of top-up for domestic bidders in the absence of a European hydrogen backbone? Will there be a geographical criterion for off-taker bids? Since we expect that CEE and Blue Banana will have a deficit and Iberia and Nordics a surplus of green hydrogen.
Yeah, very specific question. So I unfortunately cannot tell you more at this stage about other member states beyond Austria and Germany. Austria is just passing a budget law to contribute 400 million for Austrian projects. I think it's going through their parliament this week. On other countries, I can't tell you publicly yet who it is, but there are more than these two. And the second question is, will we have geographical baskets, right? So will we have some sort of quota of where the projects have to be? That is currently not planned. The Innovation Fund has a target of geographical balance across Europe until 2030, across all programs of the fund. And we don't want to start to micromanage individual programs like the auction, which is just one of many programs within this fund, because different regions are good at different things. And if you look at other products like, I don't know, manufacturing of components or the chemical sector or cement, you see a very different geographical balance than what we just saw for this hydrogen auction. So we're going to have a look how it balances out across all sectors. And then if we need to take hard action, like limited benchmarked, earmarked budget for specific regions, we'll do that later on. But at the moment, we work with soft instruments like regions where the project proposal quality is not that good, or we don't get enough bids or enough proposals. We support them with technical assistance. We help the companies to improve their financial models or their applications to us. So we try to be bottom up for now, but later on, if we need to, we have a legal mandate for geographical balance until 2030.
Perfect. Johanna, perhaps?
Thank you so much until now. My question is actually was answered right now a bit, but I also want to know what is the actual promise in the end, that the EU will be the best place to produce, to have hydrogen always as an option, to have a base load. How is this going to work out in the end? I just don't see it right now.
I mean, no one has a glass ball, right? But I very much agree with, you have to have a vision and you have to bring people along on that vision. And I think just with regards to hydrogen, we know we need both imports and EU domestic production, because the potential industrial demand for hard to abate sectors is probably large enough that we won't be able to cover all of that with EU domestic hydrogen production. Plus, we just need to electrify a lot still. I mean, let's not forget, we are nowhere near getting the power sector to fully renewable, and that's the first challenge in a sense before we can put all of that power into synthetic fuel production. So I think there's a place both for production here, also to learn, to develop capacity, to have security of supply, but definitely also imports. Yeah, we need to strike a balance between both.
One more question in the back and then one here. I have more questions too. Let the audience speak first.
Thanks to the panel and Johanna for that last presentation. My name is Manuel and I have been working on green hydrogen for a couple of years, and the economics that you commonly find in literature for the cost of production, as you say, would be expected to be much higher than what came up now after this first round of your auction. I wonder, first of all, what happens in the case that these companies fail to actually meet those production prices? Are there sanctioning mechanisms? And also, like, were you able to verify that this is feasible economics behind those projects? I would just be curious on how you perceive this aspect.
Yeah, also really great question. So maybe first on the literature and the cost. I think we, just for clarity, what they're bidding is not the full project cost. What they're bidding is a premium on top of the revenues that they can achieve in the market. So let's say the winner with roughly 50 cents will get 50 cents on top of the offtake prices. We saw median offtake price maybe €4.50. So the whole LCOH then comes out at €5 per kilogram. And I think that's something we also see in the literature possible in regions with cheap electricity prices. So I think it's not actually that far off what we see in some studies. Then what's the penalty for not building? If you put in, we want to avoid speculative bids. We want that these projects build. So we introduced a completion bond. If these projects bid and win and then they don't build within a maximum number of years, they have to, not only do they not get paid and lose their contract, their support contract, they also have to pay a penalty of 4% of the total subsidy. And for the next round, we're suggesting to rack up that penalty to 10%. So in the first auction, it was important to have enough bidders and to make sure it works, because had it not worked, there would have been no second round, I can assure you. And now in the second round, we can afford to crank up the pressure a little bit. And yeah, but to the question on what checks did we do? Yes, we did check their financial models, and we made sure for every project that there's enough capital injections at every stage of the project to do the capex spend to do maintenance, refurbishment, capex, etc. So the financial model has to work. But if the company is taking a loss with that project, we leave that open to the bidders. And I can't tell you anything about the winners. What I can tell you is that amongst the 7 winners, there's at least 2 projects who are funded by infrastructure funds. So these are guys that have really no incentive to take a strategic loss, because the only purpose of a fund is to yield a return. So I think it's, for analysis purposes, it's also really interesting to look at who's the project sponsor behind the bid.
And there's one more in the, well, you had a question. I go to you because you talked before and you had a question specifically on EU. Yeah, please.
The question goes a bit in the direction, why did you choose to subsidize the difference between levelized costs and offtake? Because my gut feeling is that the high willingness to pay that we see in mobility might actually be something that will not necessarily come through. At least that's my personal perspective. So let's say if you have a project that has a willingness to pay of 8.5 euros per kilogram, it's no wonder that you can make it happen with only, let's say, 50 cents or something per kilogram of subsidy, because the LCOH still lies at somewhere around 8-ish euros per kilogram, which is not, from a production point of view, not very innovative and probably also not very sustainable. So the question is, if you agree with this point of view, do you see any chance of improving in that direction?
So I would also love to move a bit back towards the broader question as well. Just a quick answer for that one. We don't tell them what to bid. It's a rational strategy to bid between your LCOH and your revenue, but we don't enforce a specific bidding strategy. So that's, the auction is not designed in a way that they have to bid, that they can bid whatever they want. They can literally bid whatever they want. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the UK, for example, does a different model where they have a more of a CFD style hydrogen auction, and they pay up to the price of gas, which is a lot lower. And that auction cleared at roughly, I think, £10, which is a lot higher. So I think there's also a lot of disadvantages to that, because it takes away the incentive of the producer to negotiate the best price that he can get. And that's something we want to keep, because we want them to negotiate. And if they made a miscalculation and their off-taker cannot actually pay that price, that's a project risk. If they then can't materialize, they can't sell to anyone, they fail, they don't get paid, and they pay us a penalty back. So we leave that counterparty risk entirely with the private sector. We don't take it.
One more question here, and then perhaps.
Thank you. Question is regarding hydrogen for the panel. What are the drawbacks or risks of using hydrogen or using a lot of hydrogen? And here I'm thinking, comes from water, there's electricity, there's potentially very volatile gas, explodes easily, and so on. In general, what are the risks and drawbacks, and why are we sort of betting on a lot of hydrogen?
That comes back to my question more or less. No? Karsten.
I think we all know it differs very much in terms of applications. So on the heating side, my guess, heat pumps are so much more energy efficient than we will not use much hydrogen at all. And storage is tough. On the transport side, looks increasingly like very niche applications in the transport part. I think then you come to industrial processes. There, if you need very high temperatures, then suddenly that's an application area, whether it's on glass or steel, or in some areas in the chemical sector, or refining already uses quite a lot of hydrogen today. So I think this is the kind of map where we have, and then more of this question, okay, and how much of this will be produced through hydrogen or ammonia imported or other products? I think there's a set of uncertainties around it. So from this perspective, a very early kickstarting the process, I think, is helpful. The tricky part becomes if we were to phase up or scale up this hydrogen support, because that effectively subsidizes one energy carrier compared to other energy carriers. First of all, distorts choice of what is the most efficient energy carrier for this technology in glass making, for example. And secondly, it reduces energy costs and therefore reduces the incentive to be efficient with energy. And ultimately, we have constraints on how much energy we can source in Europe, because wind and solar potentials are somewhat, at least if socially acceptable, constrained, and imports are expensive and risky and will remain in this area. And the technologies that we want to export and use globally will be applied largely in regions like India or China, which also have constraints on energy availability. So also there, having a very strong focus on energy efficiency, material efficiency, circularity will remain important, and therefore we should be very careful in not subsidizing energy inputs, which give us the wrong incentives along these lines.
Maybe to build on what Karsten said is really the nice thing about our CCfD scheme. Because now we've talked to a lot of companies and many of them work in the same sector and want to produce the same product. It's interesting to see that there's not one single answer. There's so many different technologies that they're working on, and I'm really looking forward to mid-July when we see what their final bid is. But yeah, the real answer to the question is that no one knows it. And we just need to make sure from a policymaker point of view that we encourage the best to win.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you both said. If you look at the Innovation Fund in general, we spent 800 million on this hydrogen auction. We spent 4 billion on other industry decarbonization technologies. And that includes a lot of direct electrification, energy savings measures, all of that. So I agree there is no silver bullet and hydrogen will not solve all our problems. What's also really interesting to look at is the latest ARPA-E results from the US. They had a challenge program for steel, and steel is one of the areas where also the literature tends to say we can only do it with hydrogen, we need hydrogen for it. But actually there's increasingly lots of research and pilot projects and demonstrators on direct reduction of iron ore and technologies that don't use hydrogen for iron and steel. So I think that's a space to watch. And the US is really advanced on that. Companies like Boston Metals or others that try to pilot this, I think it's really interesting to watch because of that efficiency loss. If you turn power into hydrogen, you immediately lose 30%. So I think the space of what can be electrified, that's a shifting target as well. We don't really know yet.
But then coming back to my question, Johanna, so what's the rationale to still, well, you already said it's a small program, you have others for other technologies, but why, from an innovation and search process perspective, why do you go at all for auctions that are technology specific? Wouldn't you learn more if you kept it open?
We might, but we simply don't have the budget for European CCfDs. And then hydrogen was also a big priority for the Commission President. So there's a lot of considerations that went into that choice, and budget is a big one. Yeah.
But to come back to that, Karsten, and perhaps later Friedrich, from a economic perspective, because of course it's clear. I mean, as a region, we are in a world with lots of geoeconomic tensions, big players wanting to take the technology lead. And then can Europe afford not to have dedicated funding streams in order to, promote this transition, do the search process, have innovation funding in order to find out where the places, where the regions that can do this best, what are the technologies that we can develop? I mean, this whole plethora, we have some funding at the EU level, but very difficult to put together. Then member countries do their own thing, etc. Well, can this be a learning process, something positive, or would we be much better off if we did more or less everything at the EU level?
I think there's two parts to it. One is, do we need a dedicated funding stream for this transition? And I think we also need it. We need more public funding altogether, whether it's for thermal retrofits of building, of the social dimensions, and so on. And many of these elements are in national budgets, national interests, and can be taken forward nationally. As soon as you come to more innovation, there's more spillover across Europe, so it's more of a European affairs element. And then if you talk about new challenges, new budget lines, industry, I feel altogether, is really good in lobbying to prevent elements to go forward. The German automotive industry is actually quite good in also lobbying to get their agenda pushed forward positively in coordinating. But I was really, with the CCfD element in industry has been there for quite a while, and that's why I said it was, for me, quite uncertain where they would come through. It was partially reflected in the coalition agreement, so there was a little bit of an anchor point. But then it took really a lot of internal negotiations, and heads up, to kind of push this element through, to get a new funding stream out of something which at the time till last fall felt like we have a big budget and the Climate Transformation Fund in Germany, different from many other states, to take it forward. So I think that's why we need this dedicated funding stream. That's why the new commission came in with a proposal. We go to auctions and a CBAM implemented within 1 year. Then it was 2 years, and then it was gradually phased back. And I felt academics and think tanks really did a bad job in promoting throughout this entire process to say the CBAM can work. There were so many statements, it can work, we can do it quickly. And at the end now, actually everyone agrees, actually, well, we have the export, we have the value chains. So I felt it was not the commission by themselves to be blamed on this, but it was really the sense where I really struggled with us in the academic space, that everyone comments on everything, even so you haven't been looking in detail, because the others comment on it. So there was a sense the CBAM will do the trick, so we can quickly implement it, we quickly get the auction revenues, we have the funding stream. So the Commission went into this process 5 years ago in the sense they have the funding stream. And then it was phased out, and I have to do it a bit later, and then it was anticipatable that this phase-in of auctioning is delayed overall. So that's why I think we need the funding stream and need it based on a clear statement. And it will inherently be a funding stream that goes partially at the European level and partially to member states. I felt as one assistant to the European group said she became a minister at a member state afterwards. And after she became a member state minister, she said, now I understand, yes, we need half of the revenue at our member state level. Otherwise, we don't get the agreement at the member state level for this European instrument. And finally, I think part of the reason why you also tender for premiums, fixed premiums, is because there you know what you are paying for, what you're committing to. Brussels doesn't have a multi-annual commitment mechanism like we would have in any member state, where you can say, I guarantee this payment, and if, for what instance, the prices turn against me in 1 or 2 years, I have to pay a lot. It's painful, it's really painful, but it's possible still to do that. At European level, we couldn't do all this risk hedging part. And we know we don't have the public funds to pay huge volumes of grants. We have to work with risk hedging elements, and that needs to be anchored in member states that have the sovereignty to make this risk hedging part. So that's why we need the stream as a European instrument, because I don't see how we have the political will of member states to do it on their own, but partially channeled back to member states to then implement elements around it.
It's almost like, no, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, one aside, I mean, that's going really niche now, but for those of you who followed the ETS negotiations 2 years ago, we negotiated terms on provisioning for European CCfDs, so that's how much budget we need to set aside for the worst case scenario where the carbon price falls to 0, and we have to pay the whole difference between 0 and the 120 euros on Friedrich's slide. And there we tried what you just said, and we tried, ooh, why can't member states guarantee some part of that? And we've maybe put a price floor in, and we share that risk between the European budget and member states' budget. And I mean, the answer was no so quickly. You could have blinked in the meantime. So there is really additional constraints on the European level. We can't tax, so we don't have a budget like a member state, and that also means we cannot do the same things in the same way.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, I have so many more questions. I have one little and perhaps technical question to you, Friedrich, or to you, Friedrich and Johanna, because, but then we have to stop, unfortunately. It was very exciting. But I was puzzled because you said, Friedrich, okay, we don't go for the bakers, we don't go for the SMEs, we want to go for the big fish with CCfD. And you said, oh, we want to make it really easy so that SMEs and startups can apply. Where does this difference come from? Why?
Well, I would always think, and I think we can see that the CCfD scheme in Germany is also there for SMEs, and it's designed for startups to come. So, and maybe there will be some, we'll see. But at the end, when you start making a scheme, you need to decide whether you make it very efficiently, and then it becomes a little bit complex, and it's only there for the very big ones, or whether you make a scheme that's maybe not as efficient and targets a broader number of small companies. And of course, in the political sphere, at least in Germany, there's the thing about the Mittelstand and about the SMEs that you need to support. So there's a tendency to also go into that direction. But when we want to tackle the big problem of the 20+% CO2 emissions from the industrial sector, you just need to tackle the big dirty companies, and those are the big ones. So that's why we designed the scheme for them and not for the very small ones.
Got you. This was great. I learned a lot. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks also the audience, very well knowledgeable and engaged. This was a fun discussion, and well, I think we are moving to a break. Yeah.